Well, good morning. Just to stay on time, we are going to start. Thank you very much for getting up so early. This is a very busy meeting, and we truly appreciate that you selected this session this morning. This is going to be a new venture. We are going to have a joint session with our European colleagues, the European Society for Vascular Surgery and the European Journal of Vascular and Endovascular Surgery. The goal is to try to get to you our message how to write a paper and have it accepted in our journals. And I'm going to start right away to give you a little update about the Journal of Vascular Surgery and tell you what papers have the best chance to get into the Journal of Vascular Surgery publications. Well, first, all of you probably know it by this time that we have three different journals. The arterial journal, that's now actually in red, just to make it easy. The blue journal is the Journal of Vascular Surgery, Venous and Lymphatic Disorders. It is still a young journal, just started in 2013, but it is growing, and based on the downloads in 2016, we are extremely optimistic it's going to be a popular and great journal. We also have the Journal of Vascular Surgery. It used to be called Cases. Now we accept Cases and Innovative Techniques. We changed a little bit the title, and it is hopefully going to be also a popular journal. It is currently an online journal. You want to publish in high-impact journals, and we are pleased to say that the Journal of Vascular Surgery and the European Journal of Vascular and Endovascular Surgery are the leaders in this field. Our red journal that is printed in over 4,000 copies has a very high number of monthly visits and an impact factor of 3.4. The Venous journal is also a printed and online journal. It has, as a young journal, appropriately lower monthly visit, and our impact factor is still low, 0.8 right now, but we hope that it is going to grow. The Venous journal is bi-monthly, comes every second month. The Cases and Innovative Techniques is a quarterly journal, but the minute it is accepted, it is online. You, as the author, keep the copyright of your manuscript, but it is an open access journal. It has a small fee of $500 compared to some of the other journals and other type of articles where you have to pay $3,000 for an open access. Currently, it's not yet indexed in PubMed. It is obviously indexed within Elsevier, and it's indexed cross-indexed with all the JVS journals. And certainly an excellent way to take your article and put it on the web, whether it is LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. Our goal is to be the premier international journal of medical, endovascular, and surgical care of vascular disease. So obviously these are the topics that we favor: medical, endovascular, and surgical care of arterial, venous, and lymphatic diseases. Read the JVS instructions for authors. It has a lot of great ideas, not only about the content, but also about the format, about the style, and the limitations and possibilities that you have as far as number of pages, number of references. And these are, believe it or not, extremely important to have high citation articles. These are the different article types that you can submit, and it is a list of over 20 different type of papers. Most of the submissions we have, 52%, are clinical papers, followed by case reports, basic research papers, review papers, and letter of editors. and then you see the rest of the articles there. You are competing with the world. We are an international journal. Only 44% of our submissions come from the United States. China is getting extremely strong, 8%, Japan 6%, Italy 5%, United Kingdom, Netherlands, and Germany is the order afterwards. So just that you know, this is a truly international journal with dozens of other countries submitting. These are the acceptance rates, and we have article types where the acceptance rate is 100%. If we ask somebody to write a commentary, we work with them until this will be publishable, and the acceptance rate has been last year 100%. If you are the president of the Society for Vascular Surgery, you have excellent chance to be printed and have accepted your presidential address. On the other hand, as you can see, clinical papers 49%, case reports 32%. If you publish a paper that you presented at a meeting, your acceptance rate goes up. You can see that this is last year's, but every year it changes. Last year, the Vascular and Endovascular Surgical Society had a truly outstanding acceptance rate. Society for Vascular Surgery had 70%, but again, as you remember, these are higher numbers when you just submit with an unaffiliated presentation. Now, this is very important. We have increased significantly the number of statistical reviews, and that's why we invited Dr. Richard Amdur today to help you a little bit with our current views on statistics. We think it is extremely important. We get a high number of papers of different registries, for instance, where we really want to be sure that all the statistics are correct. Which papers have a best chance? Well, obviously, we are looking for papers that will be cited and that provide high level of evidence. And the papers that give us that have the highest level of evidence are obviously practice guidelines, meta-analysis, systematic reviews. Meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials probably is one of the highest cited papers. But randomized controlled trials and prospective studies, prospectively collected or prospectively analyzed, or prospectively collected and retrospectively analyzed. So these are the papers that we are looking for. There is a lot around the literature to help you how to get your citation higher. And this is an interesting paper that I found, 33 ways to improve your citations, and a couple of good ideas. Obviously, these are the papers that we are looking for. We are looking for paper that will have high citations, that's going to help our journal, and that's going to help you. Use more references. There is a ridiculously strong relationship between the number of citation of papers received and the number of its references. So use up the references that you are allowed to use in your manuscript. Publish longer papers. We are not going to accept if you exceed the recommendations, but use up your page numbers. Again, longer papers have more citations. And the idea that I really liked was this one. If you have a friend who got a Nobel Prize, publish your paper with a Nobel laureate. We have done some changes in the journal. We increased the number of references, allowed references, from 40 to 50 for clinical research papers. And we decided not to limit the authors because of the number. But if each author has to meet all 4 authorship requirements: substantial contribution, drafting and revision of the paper, final approval, and accountable for all aspects of the data, including data integrity. So I'm going to leave you with my ideas of how to increase your citations and give you the top 10 list to increase your citations. Number 10, certainly publish in high-impact vascular journals. And our arterial journals, the European journals, have the highest in vascular surgery. And knowing the numbers, I am very sure that the venous journals within a year or two is going to be there as well. Number 9, publish with a team of authors. It always helps your citations if you have other co-authors, because obviously they are going to cite your work as well. Number 8, publish multidisciplinary or multi-institutional study. Again, it is very important that we spread out to other specialties and we work with other institutions. That's going to help your paper be cited more frequently. Number 7, you want to have your paper be known, and one of the ways to do it is a new feature of the Journal of Vascular Surgery: submit a video or audio slide presentation with your manuscript. If you have a video that's about 5 minutes, we are going to put it online, and it will be available to view for the readers together with your manuscript. Also, the journal website has the instructions how to download a slide presentation, and you can dictate your presentation, and that's going to be available online. When you publish articles, use strict guidelines to have a much better chance to have that accepted and also cited. So if you have a case report, use the CARE guidelines. Number 5, if you publish an observational study, use the STROBE guidelines. Number 4, if you publish analysis of prospectively collected registry data, obviously use one of these registries, and this morning you are going to hear ample information about all of the registries that are listed here. Number 3, if you publish a prospective randomized studies, use the CONSORT guidelines. Number 2, if you publish a systematic review or a meta-analysis, please use the PRISMA guidelines. And finally, the number 1 on the list of 10 to increase your citations is that you should join a writing group of an SVS document, practice guidelines, reporting standards, or new classification of vascular disease. You have an excellent chance, close to 100% of acceptance and a very wide citation. Thank you very much. We are going to go on with the presentation of the editor-in-chief of the European Journal, Dr. Philip Kolh. And Dr. Kolh is going to tell us what are the papers we are looking for to publish in the European Journal and why.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to lecture at this breakfast symposium. Well, obviously, I share everything that was just said by Professor Gloviczki. It's obvious that we are looking for the same type of manuscripts and the same types of retrospective or prospective studies. So basically, I have no disclosure. First, looking at the editor-in-chief, senior editor of the journal, and the associate editors, you will see the type of manuscripts that we actually are looking for. We, the editor-in-chief and the senior editor, review most manuscripts. We get about 1,000 submissions a year. So most are reviewed by either myself or Florian Dick. Now, we have a guideline editor, who is Gerd de Borst, who is in the room. So we try to publish 2 or 3 guidelines a year, and obviously joining a writing group of guidelines, and we are currently developing joint guidelines with the SVS and the World Federation on CLTI, obviously will improve any citation. We then have a specific editor for reviews and correspondence with Marc Coulemet. We have a specific editor, associate editor for randomized trials, methodology, and statistics, and the same then for JVS. We give a lot of importance in statistical analysis and statistical review. I will come back to that. We have a specific editor for complex endovascular therapies with Eric Verhoeven from Germany, well known in that field. We have 2 specific editors for vascular biology, biomedical engineering, and transnational medicine. Those are Nabil Chakfeh from Strasbourg and Melina Vega de Seniga from Spain. We have 2 venous editors. We don't have a specific journal for venous disease. So far, we don't see a need for that, but they may come in the future, but that's not the case. That's Marianne de Massener from Rotterdam, and recently Stavros Kakos from Greece. And then we have also specific editors for education, CME, educational papers, editorials, Jonathan Boyle from Cambridge, and Melina Venga again. And finally, we have also an associate editor for Kudai, technical innovation, short report, and online interaction, who is Arindam Chaudhuri. So you can see that we receive between 100 and 1,000 manuscripts. You see how they are divided. Original articles, de novo are articles that have been rejected, but for which we think there may be an opportunity for resubmission if the methodology is good, and maybe some more patient or animals can be added, or a different type of analysis can be performed, and they can be resubmitted. Reviews. Kudai are actually literally blink of an eye, where an author submits a very nice, high-quality picture with a maximum of, I think, 80 words, 80 or 100 words. So it usually it's used to fill the space, let's say when we have half a blank page at the end of the manuscript. For those of you, for example, that read the New England, you know this is something, well, the New England published various type of pictures. Now, what are key questions for your manuscript? I will try to be a little more specific and tell you what you have to look in the abstracts, the introduction, the material methods, the results, and so forth. Well, the first one is, why did you undertake the study? This should, for the reviewer, that should be very clear when he or she has read the introduction. What do you want to do? What is the incremental value to the field? What's the aim of your study? The second is, what did you do? Material and methods. The third is, what were your findings, that what we are looking for in the results. And finally, what does it mean? And this will be in the discussion. So usually we end up with manuscripts with too long an introduction, and sometimes actually the author discuss their results in the introduction, which you should never do. You should discuss your result in the discussion. The methods are usually too short. They don't explain well. If the methods is long, we can put part of them in supplementary material on the web. So the key of the methods is that it should be reproducible by another center. The results are sometimes too short, it depends, and the discussion is usually too long, at random, and not necessarily focused on the discussion of the results. So the key point also is the title. And if you want somebody read your manuscript or better cited, the title is important. Well, sometimes we have very long title with even the number of patient, 2,542 patient with. That's a way to do it. It catches the eye because we know it's a very large series. But sometimes a very short and up-to-the-point title can be extremely interesting. For example, treating claudication in 5 words. So do not underestimate the importance of the title. It may be the reason someone reads your paper. Do not use abbreviation and be short and informative. Then the abstracts. The abstract should be an accurate summary of your study. The aim should be very clearly stated. The methodology should be explained. Is it retrospective or prospective? It's very bad when after having read the abstract we don't know whether it's a retrospective or a prospective study. It's usually because it's retrospective and the authors want the reviewer to believe it's prospective. That's not good. Is it randomized? What are the inclusion period? When does it start? When does it stop? The number of patients or animals, and what type of statistical analysis was performed. Do present results with numbers if possible. That's always key. And round numbers are always preferred than percentages. Percentage can be added, but the round number, the precise number, is always very important. And do present, if it's possible, if the number of cases allowed to do that, multivariable analysis. And the conclusion of the abstract should be supported by the results that are reported in the abstract. If you don't report the results in the abstract, do not conclude upon something that you have not reported. The introduction should be focused, 1 page, 2 page, when it's in Word format, should be a brief summary of the current knowledge. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. What do we know? Have you read other manuscripts? And statements should be supported by references. It's not good when you have 2 pages of introduction and there is no reference. It's not necessarily better if they have 50 references to support it, an adequate number. If you have published on the same topic previously, do cite it. It's good to know that you're actually building upon previous results of your group or somebody else from your group. And clearly state the aim of the study, what you try to prove or to show or not to prove. Avoid several aims. That's usually very complicated when it can be possible, but usually the statisticians will not like that too much. The methodology is obviously the very important section. That's usually the number 1 reason for rejecting a manuscript, is that if the methodology is adequate, the study likely fall apart. So do not hesitate to discuss with a statistician before starting your study. The methodology should include a full description of the study, including the character, single center or multi-center, the inclusion period, the exclusion criteria, the length of follow-up, the experimental protocol, and we should have very careful definitions, because you'll be amazed how many various definitions, for example, of renal insufficiency you can find in the literature. Is it an increase in creatinine by absolute value or percentage or whatever? And the statistical analysis is obviously key. The result should be clear. Statistical analysis, appropriate illustrations, no redundancies between text tables and figures, and overall tables and figures will enhance clarity. The discussion should present a very short summary of the result to start with. Place the study into perspective with the literature. What have you found? Is it different? Is it in opposition with what we previously known? Or is it an incremental knowledge to the field in the same directions? Acknowledge the limitation. There are always limitations of a study. If you can go to the New England manuscript, you will see there are always limitations. And emphasize possible clinical implications. Do we expect change in practice because of that or not? And a short conclusion. So finally, and I will conclude on these 2 slides, why are papers rejected? Well, because the experimental design is poor, because it's a repetition of other studies with nothing new, because the hypothesis was not explained, because the description of the study methods and the statistical analysis were poor, because the sample size is too small, because the follow-up is short or inadequate. If we look about endoleak and you have only, for example, 2 weeks or 1 month follow-up, we know that it's the same than 5-year follow-up, because the text is not comprehensible, because you do not conform to the journal standards, because the results are over-interpreted, because the literature review has not been properly analyzed and reported, because the conclusions are not supported by the data or not justified, and because the author is unwilling to amend manuscript after reviews. That's sometimes very difficult, is that after 1 or 2 reviews with extensive comments, well, we get answer, thank you very much, but no change has been done in the manuscript. So then we have to reject it. So what we are looking for are Exactly, I think, the same then for the JVS. High-quality manuscript that should have an impact on clinical practice, trigger further research and scientific thought, will be of interest for our readership and bring incremental knowledge to the field of vascular surgery and vascular science. Thank you very much for the privilege of the floor.
Thank you very much, Philip. It was an excellent presentation. It's a pleasure to introduce the senior editor of the JVS journals, Dr. Peter Lawrence from UCLA. And Dr. Lawrence is going to tell us the secrets of a successful clinical research paper.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for the introduction, Peter. And many things that Philip said I would concur with, and there are some subtle differences between the European Journal and the JVS, and I'll try to highlight them. But I'd also like to compliment all of you. It's nice to see a full group here. It shows how interested you are in both publishing and also publishing high-quality papers. So what I'm going to talk about is the tricks to getting a paper published and what represent the best clinical papers. And when you think about it, you start with a topic, and that is what's of interest to not only you, but also a potential audience. What's innovative, unique, different. This term peeling an onion, where you just keep writing about the same thing and adding a few more patients, is less appealing, obviously, to a journal than an innovative, unique approach, something that's very original, and importantly, something that's appropriate for the vascular audience. We see some papers that are tremendous papers, but they're dealing with a head and neck topic or something that may not be of interest to our readership. So it's got to be appropriate for any one of the three for the Journal of Vascular Surgery, either totally venous, totally arterial, or a case report or innovative technique. So how do you tell if you have a worthwhile project? Well, the way we do it at our institution and the way I think we like to see it done in our journal is, first of all, that people do a very thorough literature review to know what's already in the literature. There's no sense in publishing or sending in a Me Too paper unless there's something unique that it adds to literature. So we're looking, and I think you should be looking, for gaps in the topic and the largest previous study. If you see a study from, for example, I'm often seeing Dr. Gloviczki's institution, Mayo Clinic, with 1,100 patients, and you're working on the same topic and you've got 180, you know that that's going to probably be a problem unless you've got something very unique. What's the most recent publication? There's some great papers that are 20 and 30 years old where technology has changed. Now, I put this up not because we didn't share slides and discuss it, but let you understand that from a journal standpoint, there are priorities. And I would say that the Journal of Vascular Surgery has focused in the past, because of what's been submitted, to the B and C area, to either prospectively collected registries, case control studies, something from that point down. What we're trying to emphasize and increase is the number of randomized controlled trials, guidelines, meta-analyses. And part of the reason for that is that they're highly cited, but also all of you have heard about MedCAC and Medicare and how it decides on reimbursement. They want to see things in the B and A level for it to change practice and change reimbursement. So it's both the journal and society and patients want to see those. As you heard from Philip, the title is very important. I've read a couple of articles where they've said that editors and audience read three things before they decide whether to read a paper. Number one, the title. Number two, the abstract. And they look at the figures and illustrations. And if any of those bother them or they don't like it, then they don't read the paper. So the title is important. And there are several ways to do it. One is to put your conclusion as the title of the paper, short but a conclusion. But it shouldn't make claims. We don't like to see papers that say this is the largest paper ever published. As you probably know, in some of the very original Nobel Prize-winning DNA research, they were very modest claims and a very modest title. So unless you think you've got a Nobel Prize-winning project, keep it modest. The authors, you already heard that there's no limit on authorship, but the importance of the contribution. I'm going through the paper, obviously, but it's helpful that the senior author is known, and so I won't amplify that any more than to say, as an author, it's critical that you only publish things that are original, because every paper published in the JVS is searched in Authenticate, and if you have duplicated, copied from a previous paper, or you as an author have published previously on the same topic, it will immediately come up on Authenticate. You heard some about the abstract, and I'm not going to go through anything except for the fourth point. Don't make errors or mistakes. If we read an abstract and there's lots of typos and errors in grammar, people will either stop reading if they're the audience, or the editors will have some concerns about that. So no mistakes in either grammar or syntax. Make sure you spell check. And also make sure that your abstract is consistent with the paper. We often know that papers like abstracts at this meeting are written, and then you may modify the actual paper. You have to also go back and modify the abstract so they're consistent. The introduction, and you've already heard from Philip some of this, but generally there are 3 paragraphs. First is a general introduction, second narrows it, and third and most critical is you state a research question and you use it in the terms hypothesis or aim. Then how did I do it? And the one thing that I will mention in the methods area, is that we need all of these components to it, but statistics are absolutely crucial, and you'll hear a talk on statistics and how that should be done. But I'm going to just mention a couple at the bottom. There's a couple of famous quotes about statistics, but it's not only that you have statistics significant than statistically, but it's got to be clinically significant and important. And there was a famous quote by H.L. Mencken, who's from many years ago, "A difference to be a difference must make a difference." And the other is, if it's not obvious, if you need statistics to see something, it cannot be that important. Now, we obviously require statistics, but just be aware of the fact that statistics should be used and they should be very clearly stated, and you'll hear more in detail about that. Then on the results, what did you find? I think that since that has been well discussed by Philip, the last point I'd like to make is the perfect paper, and this is a JAMA editorial, and what motivates them to accept a paper is they believe that, and I think it's probably true, that a paper, that the results could be distilled to one table or figure and discussed in one page, that those are some of the greatest because they answer a specific question. How you display the data, we see a lot of life tables in vascular disease management. And remember, one of the things we're looking for is the number of years of follow-up and then number of patients in the last 2 or 3 columns. So if you start with 1,000 patients and your N at the end of the life table 3 years later is 4 patients, obviously that's not going to be as relevant as if you have a 50% follow-up and it's for 2 years. The other thing that's emphasized in much of the literature on how to have a successful paper is the primary outcome variable, what some people call POV. It's really the purpose of the study, and it needs to be measured at least 6 or 12 months. And the study is often powered by that. So having a single primary outcome variable is the best. It's very difficult to have more than one. As far as the discussion, you heard some of this, but answer what did the research or the question, how was it answered? What was the primary outcome variable? Put the study in context, discuss the limitations. If you're going to do future studies on the same project, you want to mention that, but briefly, and then have a conclusion. And some would say that, as I said, that the title, the abstract, and the last sentence, the conclusion, the summary, is just as important as the introduction. So make sure that you don't lose your enthusiasm and your energy for that final message. What are you trying to tell people? What's your summary and conclusion? And make sure that the abstract and the paper agree with each other. Now, I'm just going to finish up with some general advice. Number one is make sure you pick the correct journal. If we see a great head and neck paper or an intracranial aneurysm paper that's not relevant to our readership, we may not take that paper, even though it's a great paper. And then within the JVS, submit it in the correct category. We'll try to modify it, but there are different categories and different criteria, and I'll show you that table in a minute. And then if you have any special issues, don't hesitate to put them in a note to the editors. I need additional words, or I have 3 figures more than I should, or that's allowed, and I would like leniency in that, and why you need that. So this is the current JVS, and you can see all the categories, but every one of them has a difference in abstract, body, figures and tables, and references. So you need to know what those are, stay within the limits of the paper, and all of this is in the JVS on the website as well. As far as revisions, if you get a paper and you're asked for major, minor revisions, make sure that you respond to them point by point, and be respectful for the reviewers. These are volunteers, so don't attack the reviewer. Really think about the message and try to answer each one step by step, and that will certainly help. Avoid too many of the respectfully disagrees and too much praise for the reviewers. They do this often. Just address each point. It's okay to disagree, but you need to explain why and back it up with references. Now, how do you become a great writer? Well, this expression, hours in the saddle. You've just got to do it all over and over and over again, and that's how I think you become a good author. But there are some tips, and there are 3 books, there are 3 references that I'm going to mention to you. And one of them is by Zinsser. And if you look at that, one of the quotes that I took out was, every word that serves no function, every long word that could be a short word, every adverb that carries the same meaning that's already in the verb. If you go on, these are the 1,001 adulterants that weaken the strength of a sentence. And then George Orwell, whom we know for other reasons other than this, actually wrote a book on how you write, and he had 6 writing tabs. And it's sort of consistent with Zinsser. Never use a metaphor, simile, figure of speech that you see in everyday a publication, like an axe to grind or an Achilles heel. Never use a long word when a short one will do, and it's possible to cut a word out. If it is, always cut it out. And when you can, always use the active rather than passive tense. And then never use something that confuses the reader, a foreign phrase, a scientific word, when a simple one. And if you need it for the quality of a paper, it's appropriate to break the rules, but only if you think it enhances it. So I'm going to finish with just the resources which I think are helpful. The AMA Manual of Style. Feel free to read that. Certainly go to the JVS website for the details. But as far as writing, journalistic writing, and then Stephen King, another author that has been famous for things other than how to write, George Orwell, Werner's Grammar, and William Zinsser. So thanks very much for your attention. I'll be interested in your questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. The next presentation is by Peter Henke from Ann Arbor, and Peter is our basic science editor. The essentials of a successful basic science paper.
Good morning. Thank you, Peter and Peter. So I'll try to highlight a little bit some of the aspects with basic science papers, and some of it certainly is redundant with regards to what makes a good clinical paper, but we'll go forth here. A little about the basics, some do's and don'ts, just a couple examples and some recommendations, and a little bit about the process. So I think at the outset, as you saw, JVS accepts about 30 to 40% basic science papers. It's quite a bit less, and a lot of our readership are not hardcore basic biologists, but we do, I think it's a very important thing to keep publishing in the JVS, because that's where a lot of the new knowledge comes from. I'd say it's a kind of a mix between biology and device trials. Well, not device trials in humans, but in animals and this type of thing. But its JVS focus is generally more translational. But you want to really try to get the non-basic science interested, and that's generally with your abstract, and hook those who are interested to read in more depth. I'll comment that the NIH really has a strong focus now on rigor reproducibility. It's part of the grant review process, and I would just emphasize for the paper you want to have that in your methods that I'll get to in a minute with regards to these aspects. Again, you've heard a lot about good abstract writing. It really is often the only thing most readers read, and again, here where you'll get a clinician perhaps interested in your basic science study is at the abstract level. I think it sets the stage, as you've heard, and you need to be succinct. The main message needs to be conveyed, particularly in the conclusion. Some quantitative data and generally p-values are there. And the conclusions should support the data, and you heard that, to not overstate your conclusions or over-extrapolate, particularly with experimental studies. And then certainly the next steps are translation, and there's a nice clinical translational paragraph that's asked for by all JVS basic science articles. Again, for the introduction, you've heard a bit about this, but here we're bringing the clinical big picture usually. But what is the problem that this experimental research is addressing? You want to have the specific experimental disease model data, some prior studies, and your own work in this area if you've previously published. You want to highlight the gaps and or controversy in the experimental arena and state the hypothesis usually as your last statement. Now, some journals have it where then in the introduction they'll summarize all of the main findings. Generally in JVS we don't do that, or that's not commonly done. And again, the introduction is kind of a upside down triangle from broad again to specific. With regards to the methods, you want to outline the experimental protocol in the interventions, much like a clinical study. Here often a diagram is helpful, showing the mice in different groups or that type of thing. A lot of times the basic science articles are a mix of animal and or in vitro studies. I'd comment that purely in vitro cellular culture studies and that type of thing generally aren't as popular and less likely to be accepted in JVS as compared to a basic science journal, where they're using human tissue and model specifics. And again, with the methods, you want to be able to have someone else reading this be able to recapitulate those studies and or the techniques. You want to specify dosing, the genetic knockout strain, the wild types, etc. Go a bit into the assays with regards to molecular, immunologic, histologic, and some of the specialized assays you may be doing or new techniques, and of course statistics, just like with any paper. With the results, you're telling the story, and generally you're going to be starting from kind of broad to narrow. So the phenotypic differences of, if it's an animal study, for example, limb perfusion was increased X% in the Y knockout mice as an example. And then you're getting more from the descriptive side to more mechanistics, giveaway, additions, experiments, and that type of thing. I think pertinent negatives in experimental studies are important. They're often the controls. And using graphs, tables, and figures to summarize are certainly very common and highlight kind of the meat of the paper. It's my personal bias not to repeat a lot of numerical data in the text if it's in the graphs or figures, and an overview of the hypothesized mechanism if you have enough experiments to support such. So this is just from about a month ago, and you can see this is just an example of a nicely laid out Western blot. And you do really want to probably show the full blots, and there's, with regards to authenticity. And then a graph highlighting the quantitation of that is important as well. Here's just a picture of some immunohistochemistry, and again, a nicely laid out graph that shows a quantification of that. So these are, you can look at any published JVS basic science articles and see the nice ways this is done. In the discussion, again, now you're starting narrow and getting broad. So state the main findings in the first paragraph. And I like it when they say findings of this experimental study were 1, 2, 3. And then discuss those specific important findings in the context of the current and prior results, much like a clinical paper. How does this experimental study advance knowledge? And again, a little bit different than the clinical papers, where it's similar, where it's different. And I think sometimes an error that's made is repeating the results in the discussion. So here you really want to, again, compare and contrast to other studies and hit the high points. And the last paragraph should bring it back to the clinical translation and further steps that might be different than a clinical paper. In the discussion, again, at the end, there's a clinical relevance paragraph. Acknowledgments, often you're going to be acknowledging some technical support, a little bit different than clinical papers, and then certainly highlight your funding sources. And so when you're going to apply for grants or reapply, you list each paper and it's in PubMed. Here's where you want to list your R grant or your VA merit or that type of thing. Just one slide about the review process, which hasn't been touched on. It comes into JVS with process checks. Then as basic science editor, I send it out to selected reviewers with expertise, usually about 3 to 4 is the average. We collate the reviews and scores, and then if it's revised, suggested to revise, it's sent back to you as the author. The revisions are done, and then we'll either send them out to 1 or 2 of the primary reviewers, or directly, if it's a more minor revise, directly review those revisions, and then again accept minor revision, or occasionally reject those even after the revisions are made, but that's more rare. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Richard Amdur, who's one of the 4 professional statisticians. For those of you who weren't here when we first started, Dr. Gloviczki mentioned that there's been a significant change in that virtually all papers that have a significant amount of data go out to a professional statistical reviewer. So Dr. Amdur is going to tell you about how it's done and how to avoid running into problems with statistics.
Thanks. I want to thank the editors and SVS for inviting me. I'm having a lot of fun at the meeting. I have no disclosures. I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who has reviewed about 350 articles for JVS. My perspective is biased in the sense that I'm not getting the total population of studies. I'm getting studies that are referred for statistical review, so they're sort of there may be. So I can't say how many are rejected before they get to me for statistical reasons. And so I'm talking about my experience doing the reviews that I have done. Talk about power, equivalency, confounding, matching, causal interpretations, and newer approaches. If this looks at all unfamiliar, you need to quickly go and look it up on Wikipedia and study it for a long time and make sure you understand it. This is one of the important reasons that we have problems with papers. So does this look familiar to everyone? Please raise your hand if it looks familiar. Okay, good. Looks mostly familiar. I'm not going to do a whole statistical lecture here, but I'll just make a few points. The actual effect is sort of the population fact of what is the treatment effective or not. What is the effect size? Is the treatment helpful? Yes or no? That's the fact in the world. Over here you have your study result, which is in your sample. Either there is a difference or there's not a difference. Those are 2 different things, and there's 4 possible combinations of those things. Power refers to what can happen when there is an effect in the real world. Your study can find it, in which case that's good, right? That's a true positive. But you can also miss it. You can not find it. Power is the probability that you will find the effect in your study, that you get a significant result. You want that to be high. You don't want to go to the expense and trouble of doing a study where there's actually an effect and then you miss it. That would be a shame. Okay. Now, the point about this that's important is when you have a significant effect, you can say that there was a significant treatment effect. The treatment was better than the control group on the outcome variable. You can say that when you have low power, and you can say that when you have high power. If you have adequate power, meaning you have a good chance of finding an effect if it exists, but there's no effect, the significance is greater than 0.05, you can say there was no effect, the treatment doesn't seem to be very helpful, or the groups had similar outcomes. Now, the important point here is that if you have low power and the effect is not significant, you can say the effect was not significant in your results section, but in the conclusions, you can't say anything about that. It's a bit mind-boggling to understand what I'm saying here, but there's no conclusion that can be drawn about the treatment. You can't say it wasn't effective. You can't say, you can do this or that, they're equal. You can't say anything like that in the conclusion, and that needs to be understood. It's going to be hard to publish a paper with low power with a non-significant treatment effect, is the message for that one. And then equivalence is another step beyond having no difference. It's possible that treatments could be not different, but not equivalent at the same time, right? So here we have a treatment A and a treatment B, and an outcome, incidence of morbidity or mortality, and a 95% confidence interval for the, let's say A is the control or is the old treatment, and B is the new treatment that you're trying to say it's no worse than the standard treatment. They're not significantly different, but that's not the same as saying that they're equivalent. Okay, we need to remember that. There's a whole technology involved in proving equivalence, and it involves something called the delta, and it involves the fact that the new treatment's top of the 95% confidence interval is within the delta, is below the top of the delta, and you have to figure out what the delta is. If this sounds strange or unfamiliar, please go and study about equivalency trials and non-inferiority trials. So don't claim that treatments are equivalent or non-inferior unless you plan the study to address this question. You have a predefined delta, and you carefully considered the sample size that was needed. Generally, the sample size that is needed is much larger than for a superiority trial. Okay, next topic, confounding. In most surgical research papers, the question has to do with whether a treatment is producing an outcome. This is a causal effect. The treatment produces a change that wouldn't be there without the treatment. The strength of that is A here. Confounds are variables that in retrospective studies produce a spurious correlation between the treatment and the outcome. Age, sex, prior MI, CHF, hematocrit, inflammation are all examples. So each one of these has a causal effect on the treatment and a causal effect on the outcome. So age X1, so older people are less likely to get some type of open treatment versus stenting, and they're also more likely to die. So that makes stenting have a positive correlation with death. Sex and prior MI, they can also influence your choice of treatment in a retrospective study where treatment is done by clinician's choice. So there's 1,000 of these possible confounds. The observed association between the treatment and the outcome is the direct causal effect plus the effects of all of the confounds, which are x1 times y1 plus x2 times y2, et cetera. So all this stuff here and the spurious part can be large compared to A. A is what we want to know, but what we have is the observed correlation. We don't have all this stuff. So that's why we use multivariate statistics, right, to get rid of all this in retrospective studies. Of course, the best way to get rid of all that would be to randomize to treatment. When you randomize to treatment, you set all the x's to 0 because age is no longer causing people to get different treatments, neither is sex, prior comorbidities or anything. The only thing causing people to get the treatment is the random number table. And so all the x's become 0, so then this whole section of the equation becomes 0, so then the observed correlation is the same as A. And now you have the actual causal effect of the treatment on the outcome. So randomizing is great, but as databases become larger and they contain more information, we're getting more and more database studies, retrospective studies, and those are becoming more valuable. So this is the key thing in retrospective research. But you have to realize that even with multivariate statistics, you can't measure every possible confound, and controlling them doesn't really remove all their effects. So you have to assume they're still confounding. And therefore, the observed association and the direct causal effect are not the same thing. even in the multivariate model. Matching is now popular, or it's maybe past its peak popularity, but propensity scores were very popular recently. So you basically predict who got a treatment, if it's a treatment outcome study, and then use the risk of getting treatment A as the thing that you match people on. So people who got treatment B and people who got treatment A, and they're the same risk of getting treatment A, are matched together, and that way it makes it more similar to a control study, but there are problems with it too. Often people use one-to-one matching, or when often cases don't match. There's nobody who got treatment A that had a high risk of getting treatment B, so they don't match with anyone who got treatment B. So you have to ask whether the matched cases are representative of all the cases, and also how much did you lose in sample size by doing the matching. If there are 10 times as many people that got one of the treatments as the other, maybe you should match 10 to 1 rather than 1 to 1. This is probably the issue that I find the most, I write most of my comments about. I'm sure the editors are tired of seeing this in my reviews, but there's a wide, it's hard to really remember that association does not mean cause, that old phrase that we all learned somewhere along the line. It's hard to realize how many different ways we use causality in our thinking and in our writing when it's unwarranted. While Dr. Gloviczki was speaking, I was wondering, if papers with more references are more cited because they have more references, or whether having more references happens because you know more about the topic that you're writing about, and it's more cited because you know more about the topic. You see, so it may not be a causal relationship. There are 99% of the papers that we get are using traditional statistics with p-values. There have been about 3 or 4 papers using machine learning methods. How is that? Please raise your hand if anyone is familiar with machine learning methods. Okay, well, a few people are. These are sort of computerized methods for detecting associations and complicated relationships in large data sets that are commonly used in the business world. This is how credit card companies determine that someone has stolen your credit card, and they send you an email. I find it magical that they can do that. It's amazing. It's very powerful. And I do think that it should be used in medicine, and I think it certainly have a big impact. If you're going to do this, we need a lot of information about how this worked, what the methods were, and we don't want to see just, we did this and here are the results. But we're still learning how to review these kind of papers, I have to say. Information theory methods is another interesting idea. Rather than looking at whether the null hypothesis is true or not, which is what most statistics do, they tell you the p-value is the probability that the null hypothesis is true. The null hypothesis is that there's no effect. Well, often we don't really care much about the null hypothesis. We care about the alternative hypotheses, which are that there's this possible effect and that possible effect, and these different causal models of how the treatment might work. Well, information theory methods are ways to quantify the probability of the alternative hypotheses, which is a very interesting type of way of doing statistics that I learned about from reviewing a paper recently, and now I'm becoming a real advocate for this. Other important issues that get in people's way are when you're doing, when you have continuous variables that are skewed, you'll have to use nonparametric statistics and look at the data distributions, look for outliers. In multivariate models, please check for multicollinearity, which is when the predictors are all interrelated, and that can bias the standard errors. Subgroup effects. This is a big topic, actually, which I wish I could go into in more detail. You know, if you have multiple medical centers in your sample, it is possible that the treatment and outcome the treatment is not related to the outcome within any of these subpopulations. But when you put them all together, because the hospitals have different incidents of using the treatments or different preferences for the way they treat patients, and the patients differ across the medical centers, when you put these hospitals in a big graph together, there's suddenly a treatment effect. If we have more time, I can go into that more later. How covariates are selected in your multivariate models, please explain that. Confidence intervals we need for odds ratios. Please label your axes on your graphs. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So we're going to move on to Mark Schermerhorn, who's had a lot of experience with large databases, national databases, and he's going to talk about that. We have one other speaker after Mark, and then open it up for questions. So please, since I know the time is tight, write down your questions and be ready to ask them as soon as our next two speakers finish. Mark?
Thanks very much. It's a great session, and I'll try to move quickly so we have more time. I'm going to cover all of these large databases. I've divided them into administrative data and then the QI/registry data. The big things are to take home is to choose the right database for the research question that you have. And then when comparing data between different databases, you got to be careful of the different definitions. And I'll go through and highlight the strengths and weaknesses of all these different databases. So the Medicare data, we've had some success comparing EVAR and open repair, looking at late survival and late rupture and reintervention. Its strengths are huge numbers, so you can evaluate uncommon events. And then another really big strength of Medicare is that you've got unique identifiers, and you can track people over time. So you can look at survival, reinterventions, readmissions. And then also, very importantly, you can figure out pre-existing conditions by going back in time prior to the operation to see if they had prior diagnoses of certain conditions that are comorbid rather than a perioperative complication. There's inpatient and outpatient data that you can get. Part A is from the hospital coders. Part B has more specificity because physicians choose the CPT codes. The weaknesses of Medicare data, it lacks disease severity, it lacks anatomy, and the issues with the hospital coders. It also doesn't pick up anyone under age 65 unless they're disabled. You miss patients that are enrolled in the Medicare HMO, which ranges from about 10 to 20% of people over time. And some people aren't candidates for Medicare. It's also very expensive. It can cost $3,000 for each year if you're just using a 5% sample. If you use 100% of the data, it's more than $10,000 for every year that you're using. It lacks laterality, and it can be cumbersome to work with. The NIS, one of the big strengths is it's much cheaper, so $350 a year or even $50 if you're a student. Huge numbers. It includes those less than 65 years old. It includes uninsured. And then it's good for things like looking at treatment choice, as long as that treatment is something that you can actually determine based on the ICD-9 coding. In-hospital death is accurate, as is length of stay and discharge disposition. It's great for looking at trends. Here we were wondering if, with all the rise in endovascular treatment of chronic mesenteric ischemia, was there a decrease in open treatment? And the answer was no, surprisingly to us. Age, sex, and race are well coded, so it's good for disparities research. Weaknesses are that you're dependent on those hospital coders, so you have to choose procedures and outcomes that can be adequately coded with those ICD-9 codes. Also lacks disease severity for things like CHF, renal insufficiency. Has no information about anatomy. Hard to tell the difference between a pre-existing condition and a perioperative complication. And just a word about carotid interventions. We looked at our hospital coders, and they said that 17% of our endarterectomy and stent patients were symptomatic, but when Rodney Bensley went through the charts himself, it was double that, and a lot of false positives and false negatives. Same problem with perioperative stroke. You'd think, oh, wow, they were very accurate, but no, they weren't. They only had one more false negative than their false positive, so even though the numbers came out the same, it's terribly inaccurate. And then because you can't tell the difference between a pre-existing condition and a perioperative complication, it makes risk adjustment very tricky. So I tend not to do it other than for age, sex, and race. And then at least as a primary analysis. You can try to do it as a secondary analysis with the caveat that you really aren't sure about pre-existing versus not. Now, some conditions like diabetes, you know, are probably pre-existing. And then the other problem is that you have no longitudinal data and nothing after the hospitalization, even out to 30 days. HCUP, who controls NIS, they get that data from the state databases, and then there's the state ambulatory surgery database, because this is all inpatient, and NIS is all inpatient. So with this, you can get outpatient procedures. So we wanted to know if renal stenting was decreasing. We looked at NIS, and we saw a big drop. So then we said, oh, well, what if there's a rise in outpatient procedures? And we found that outpatient procedures were flat, inpatient were going down, so the overall was going down. Now I'll skip ahead to the registries, the QI databases, starting with NSQIP. Strengths, you've got these clinical reviewers that go through the charts and actually make phone calls for follow-up. Huge numbers of cases, and you get 30-day follow-up on every patient, and sometimes it requires telephone calls. We found this valuable looking at carotid endarterectomy and found that a third of all strokes and half of all deaths occurred after discharge within that 30-day period. The weakness is it tends to be expensive. There's an annual fee. You have to pay a training fee for the clinical reviewers, and then you need to pay the salary of the clinical reviewers, and we have two of them, and they are nursing salaries, so it can be pretty expensive. It's incomplete data collection if you're high volume. The follow-up is limited to 30 days. It's both a strength and a weakness because you can't go beyond that. And in the standard NSQIP files, you don't have anatomy, and the variables weren't defined by vascular surgeons, so you couldn't look at things like paralysis after TVAR. And although many people have written papers about carotid endarterectomy and stenting with the standard NSQIP, it's actually not very accurate. So we went back and compared Rodney Bensley going through the charts to our NSQIP nurses, and symptom status with carotid endarterectomy was overestimated. And that's because they just say, did the patient ever have a TIA or a stroke? Doesn't matter about laterality, and it doesn't matter if it was 10 years previously. We found that physiologic high risk was pretty well coded, but there's no information about anatomic high risk. And perioperative stroke was actually very accurate. They only had one false negative. Since 2011, there's been a big update, the targeted NSQIP module, which is made up of a subset of hospitals that collect extra detail that's actually defined by vascular surgeons. So now you can get accurate symptom status, the percent stenosis, cranial nerve injury. For PAD, you can get pre-op medications, symptoms, the anatomic level. We can get AAA diameter, the indication for repair, the extent of the aneurysm. So we were able to show that symptomatic aneurysm repair has double the mortality compared to elective repair. What it can't tell you is which specific high-risk criteria you have, anatomic or physiologic, for your carotid intervention. And you don't know if the preoperative TIA was a day before the surgery or a month before surgery. We don't know iliac diameter. And we found that more than 10% of EVARs supposedly were using iliac branch devices at a time when these had not been FDA approved. So there were some problems with teaching the reviewers. For PAD, ABIs are poorly recorded. There's no Wi-Fi data. And they only clearly identify one lesion, so that's problematic if you're doing multi-vessel interventions. Moving on to the VQI. VQI is exploding. There's 416 centers in 46 states and 3 Canadian provinces. There's 18 regional quality groups, and there's now over 370,000 patients as of May 1st, and huge numbers in all of these conditions. So wonderful numbers with a lot of detail. Follow-up can be at least to 1 year, but longer for certain things like survival. We saw that being discharged on a dual antiplatelet was associated with a higher survival compared to those who were discharged on mono antiplatelet therapy. And this shows survival differences for men and women after TVAR. And now you can link that data with Medicare, so you can get things like readmissions, reinterventions that may not be captured in the standard one-year follow-up form. And you can go into much more detail with the Medicare data. It's got surgeons, radiologists, and cardiologists, huge numbers, and a variety of types of institutions. The weakness is that one-year follow-up is not very well filled in at this point, although it's improving, and it's a major project for VQI. It's lacking follow-up data after 1 year unless you can link it with Medicare, and there are some procedures that are going to go for longer follow-up now. Can be expensive, and you need institutional participation. So the advantage of the large database studies are its effectiveness. It's not efficacy, it's effectiveness research in real-world settings, and it tends to be representative of the majority of patients and providers. You can look at uncommon or distant outcomes, and you can look at trends in treatment and outcomes over time. And at least compared to randomized trials, it's economically efficient. So while you get a better level of evidence from a randomized trial, it's hard to do a randomized trial to look at every possible research question. I'll just say a couple other things. It's good to have some training in biostats and epidemiology, whether it's a formal MPH or just a mini course, or if you have a friend who can help you out with those things. And I actually recommend this book very highly to everyone by Warren Browner, Publishing and Presenting Clinical Research. It's a great reference. It's what John Berkmeyer made me read when I started working with him, and I make all my research fellows read it. It's great to have mentors and collaborators, and then it's great to have fantastic collaborators that help you out with the process. Thanks, everyone, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to introduce the last speaker, Professor Martin Bjork from Sweden, who is the current EJVES president from Uppsala. He will lecture on the advantages of writing a successful paper with data of the Swedish Vascular Registry, the VascuNet, and the International Consortium for Vascular Registries. Martin.
Thank you so much, Philip, for the kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for showing up so early at this breakfast session and having this interest in scientific writing. That's very encouraging. I have no conflicts of interest. As you all know, America is first. And this is also true regarding the registry work. Already in 1972, this was discussed in the US, and in 1975, the Cleveland Clinic created the first multi-surgeon computerized vascular registry. In Sweden, we were very inspired by the Vietnam registry created by Norman Rich. But the question is, who is second? And if you haven't seen this hilarious video done in Holland, you must do that. You just Google Holland second, and it has been downloaded 25 million times. But actually, Sweden is second, not Holland, in this respect, because we created the SwedeVasc registry already 30 years ago. We had national coverage in 92. And unfortunately, just a few months ago, the VQI actually passed us in the number of registered patients because we only have 340,000, and now they have 370,000. And so now America is first also in the number of registered patients, I'm sad to say. But, of course, Sweden is a small country, only 10 million people. Other countries followed, however. All the Nordic countries. Northern Ireland was actually before the UK, and they didn't vote for Brexit either, by the way. Then Switzerland, Italy, Hungary, New Zealand, Australia, and Germany followed. And in 2007, the VQI, or rather the Vascular Study Group of New England, published its first paper, and then later came the VQI. And the VQI is really developed in a fantastic way, and we have a very nice collaboration with Jack Cronenweth and his group. The VascuNet is a collaboration of 12 different registries in Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. And we had our first meeting in Lisbon, 1997, and we have done a lot of merging of our different databases, resulting in some important quality improvement projects, including the one in the UK when it was verified that they had a significantly higher mortality when they operated on intact aneurysms in the UK compared to the other countries. Now, what are the strengths of registry-based data? And I will try not to repeat what Mark has already explained. Of course, you have the large numbers. You can perform subgroup analysis and also very complicated statistical analysis, including matching, propensity score matching, etc., when you have enough patients. And the main advantage here is that you don't have to confound or mix claudicants with patients with critical limb ischemia. You don't need to mix intact and ruptured aneurysms, etc. So you can get a much better study design. You can study time trends. Rare events can be studied, such as stroke after carotid endarterectomy or colonic ischemia after AAA repair. And these data reflect everyday practice. There's no selection bias. And if you perform a case control study, it can be nested in the cohort. This is an example, a very early example, where we studied colonic ischemia after AAA repair. And the fact that we could nest cases and controls within the entire cohort strengthened the study design, because according to the statisticians, epidemiologists, the main weakness of a case control study is the selection of controls. But if you can select them in the entire cohort that you are controlling, then that weakness is minimized. However, there are always weaknesses, as already has been explained. And I think when discussing registry data, you must consider validation. We have the external validity. Do we have any missing cases? In Sweden, we've registered virtually all our patients. The VQI only registered 15% of the patients operated in the US. Of course, that puts some questions when you compare these data. Are the 15% representative of the US vascular surgical activity or not? Then you have the internal validity. Are the correct data in the existing variables? That can be rather easy to check regarding sex and age, etc. But when it comes to uncommon events such as stroke after carotid endarterectomy, you really have to do a very large validation procedure to see if you are missing cases. We have seen in several analyses in the SwedeVasc and in the other VascuNet registry that missing patients that are not registered, that are missing, always do worse than those that are registered. So it's really important to include as many as possible. Another issue is, do you have self-reported outcomes, or are those independently reported? In the SwedeVasc, we never self-report death, because we have a unique personal identity number, and every week the deaths are reported to the registry through the population registry. So we don't even need to ask the vascular surgeons if the patient is dead or alive. The same thing as when it comes to stroke after carotid endarterectomy or stenting. We encourage the hospitals to have physicians, stroke physicians, to do the post-operative checkup of the patients, because we found that a stroke physician will find twice as many strokes as a surgeon. And then, of course, you have the whole issue of missing data and how to handle that. We actually moved to a new dimension in validation when we had the first international validation of the SwedeVasc registry in 2015. two vascular surgeons, Marit Venemo from Finland and Tim Lees from Newcastle, UK, spent several weeks validating our registry, and we are very thankful for that work. They choose themselves which hospitals to validate, which time period to validate, which procedures to validate. And we were very happy to see that in the external validity of the carotid endarterectomy, they didn't find one single missing case. It was a 100% validity. And then you compare with the hospital statistical system for reimbursement, the inpatient registry. So you need, of course, a golden standard or another registry to compare with to get this kind of figures. It wasn't as high for AAA repair, only 98.8%. But the 1.2% missing actually had the same death rate as those who were registered. Now, time trends are very good to study in a registry. And here is an example how we studied EVAR and open repair in Sweden from 1994 until now. And you see that, as expected, the number of open repairs are decreasing and the number of EVARs are increasing. And by 2008, more than half were done with endovascular repair. We also are possible to see what the AAA screening had, what effect that had on surgical activity in Sweden. So here you have a 21-year period where all these variables included. At the same time, we could also see that the number of ruptures are decreasing, partly because of improved smoking habits, but also because of the screening activity. We could also see that the increase in AAA repair was actually driven by EVAR that made us operate on older patients, but with good results. And we were a bit worried about long-term survival because when we operate on older, more comorbid patients with EVAR, maybe they don't survive long enough. And here we have the advantage that we can study our patients infinitely regarding survival, since we have this linkage with the population registry. And here you see the 5-year survival rates showing that actually survival has improved after AAA repair, despite that we are operating on older and more sick patients. I will also show an example of how we use the registry to study mycotic abdominal aortic aneurysms. That's a very uncommon operation. And actually, we were lucky this last year where we, during 4 weeks, had 3 papers accepted in circulation during the same month. And this was one of those. And actually, 2 of the top papers that are being discussed later here in this meeting include Swedish registry data. Also, the international variations in abdominal aortic aneurysm care paper published with Adam Beck as first author and co-written with Kevin Marney. But returning to the mycotic aneurysm paper, you see here how EVAR is becoming more and more common in Sweden for mycotic aneurysm. And we could also follow the survival in this curve until 10 years. And we saw that the EVAR-treated patients had actually a better short-term survival, but equal long-term survival, which, of course, was something that worried us. Is this really a sustainable or procedure? We've also looked at variations in EVAR and in the ICVR collaboration. And as you see here, we see not only the variations between countries, but also between centers. And we found that there was a higher rate of EVAR in patients or in countries that treat more small aneurysms. And interestingly, it's also showed that the healthcare economics seem to influence the indications for AAA repair, because in countries that have population-based reimbursement. They operate less small aneurysms and also less EVAR. Another example how we used registries is that we evaluated the national Swedish AAA screening program, where we started to screen in Uppsala in 2006, and you can see here that it progressively was increased over time in the country, which was a kind of natural experiment. And we used this as a kind of pseudo-randomized study. And always when you have a paper that seems to be published in circulation, the last sort of test is that it goes to the statistician, and just like in the JVS. And we are used to get all kinds of very difficult questions from the statisticians in this last period. But this time we got a hallelujah from the statistician, who really liked our study design because we used the progressive introduction of the screening program as a kind of pseudo-randomization. And with this, and the reason why we could do this is that we used all the registries in Sweden. We used the inpatient registry, we used the JVS registry, we used the population registry, and since every citizen has a unique personal identity number, those registry data can be merged in a kind of laboratory, which is safe in terms of patient in terms of data safety. And here you see the results that showed a significant effect of the screening program on mortality. Interestingly, not only in ruptured AAA mortality, but also on mortality in ischemic heart disease, because part of the AAA screening program is also to prevent, to introduce secondary prevention in these patients. Finally, I will just say a few words about the next step, the registry-based randomized controlled trials, because there's no contradiction between registries and randomized trials, and actually you can perform randomized trials within the registry. And the first example of that were the cardiologists in Sweden who performed the TASTE trial. You can read it, it's published in the New England Journal. And the interesting thing is that they managed to randomize 60% of the patients treated for myocardial infarction in Sweden during a full year. And so you actually have 4 outcome groups, those randomized to thromboaspiration or not, as this case, and the 2 groups who were treated with or without thromboaspiration are also reported. And it's rather interesting to see that the non-randomized patients do much worse than the randomized. We have initiated such a study in the JVS called the SwedePad study, where we test drug-eluting devices on both patients with critical limb ischemia and claudication. So in conclusion, registry-based studies complement RCTs. They are not competing. And population-based registry studies can be used to monitor disease epidemiology, study rare events, compare practices. And a combination with population-based registries and RCTs offer unique potential to perform efficient randomized trials. And last but not least, we will celebrate the 20-year anniversary of the Vascular collaboration at the EJVES meeting in Lyon in September. Lyon is also the gastronomical capital of the world. As you know, Bocuse d'Or, the Nobel Prize in gastronomy, is given each year in Lyon. And they have about 20 Michelin restaurants in this city. So you are all very welcome, not only to the scientific program, but also to a wonderful place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Well, our time is up, but I would like to let you know that the JVS has a Twitter account, a Facebook, a LinkedIn account, and we all have emails. So you should be able to, if you have questions, you should be able to get it to us, and I promise you that we are going to answer you expeditiously. I would like to thank all of you on behalf of all of us here for coming, and why don't you give a round of applause to the panel, because I think they did a great job. Thank you.